So the title of my talk is Free to Learn, How Children Educate Themselves Through Free Play and Exploration. I'm going to try to stick fairly close to my notes because if I don't, I find that I tend to wander and don't make it through all the points that I want to get through. So that outline in front of you is the outline that I'm going to try to follow. I'm an evolutionary psychologist, which means that I'm interested in human nature. And I'm interested in how human nature came about by natural selection. I'm particularly interested in the nature of human children, and most particularly in that aspect of children's nature that leads them to acquire the culture into which they're born. In other words, which leads them to be educated. You know, in our culture today, when we think of education, we think of schools, but education has been around for longer than we have been human beings because education is cultural transmission. We've been transmitting culture for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years, maybe a couple of million years. Archaeologists debate about it. But long, long, long before there was anything like school, long, long, long before there was any notion that it was adults' responsibility to educate children. That's a new idea. Throughout most of human history, children educated themselves. Now, we might think of that as surprising. How can children educate themselves? But think of little kids. Think of kids before we ever put them in school. Think of how much they learn before they ever start school. I mean, today, we're so uptight about it that we try to teach even little kids, but that's brand new. Nobody, when I was growing up, tried to teach little kids. But we learned our language, we learned to run and jump and climb, we learned to ask questions, we learned an incredible amount about the world around us with nobody teaching us. It doesn't mean that they didn't help us learn. They answered our questions, they were there, they were models. We learned our language because the language is spoken around us. But children are born to learn. That drive to learn doesn't stop when children turn 5 or 6. We shut it off. We shut it off when we send them to school because suddenly now they're in an environment where the very tools that they need, the resources that they need, the instincts that they are born with are no longer functional. Where their questions no longer count, because it's their questions that drive education, that drive their education. In school, it's not even the teacher's real questions, it's the questions of the curriculum, which are not of particular interest to anybody. And when children are in that situation, learning becomes a chore. It's even called that. It's called work. It was never work before, right? But then it suddenly becomes work. It suddenly becomes something to avoid if you possibly can, something that you have to do. That's what we do with our schools. Well, I have already wandered away from my notes. So I'll never make it through. You'll be here until the library closes. And then, I don't know if you keep the door open so you can get out or not. But okay, the thesis of my talk, the major thesis of my talk today is that play is children's natural means of educating themselves. Play and self-directed exploration. Sometimes I make a distinction between play and exploration. Sometimes I think of exploration as a sort of category of play. The first person, the first scholar really to develop this idea that play serves the function of education was the philosopher and naturalist Karl Marx, a German philosopher, who wrote a book in 1898 called The Play of Animals. So this was not too long after Darwin's Origin of Species. It was really the first person to apply a Darwinian analysis to the topic of play, and almost the only person who's done so since, to tell the truth. His thesis in The Play of Animals was that the question he asked was this: why do all young mammals play? Essentially all young mammals play. As far as we can tell, it's debatable whether the young of other kinds of animals, we don't know, young fish play or young reptiles, some evidence that at least some kinds of birds play, crows, those kinds of long-lived, smart birds play. But we do know that mammals play. In fact, I don't think there's ever been a species of mammal found that's been studied in which they were not able to find that the young of them play. But why do they play? I mean, they're wasting energy when they play. They're risking death when they play because they could be attracting predators. They play in dangerous ways. They could fall and hurt themselves, and sometimes they do. Sometimes they even die in play. Why wouldn't natural selection have weeded out play? Why shouldn't these young animals, when they're not doing something that is securing food or necessities of life, why shouldn't they just be tucked away someplace, curled up asleep, preserving energy? Well, Bruce's theory was that they play because that's how they practice and acquire the skills they need to develop to be successful in life. And this theory, which is now called the practice theory of play, is pretty well accepted by animal behaviorists who study animal play. It explains quite a number of things about play. For starters, it explains why young animals play more than older ones. They play more because they got more to learn. It explains why those species of animals that have the most to learn, that depend least on rigid instincts, play the most. So primates, monkeys, and apes play more than other mammals do, and I could go down the list. It also explains the ways in which animals play. You can more or less predict the way an animal will play by knowing what the constraints are to that animal's ability to survive and reproduce. So predatory animals play at predation. It's hard. Predation is hard. It's hard to capture animals. Animals that depend upon predation for survival have fairly long childhoods, if you will, because they have to spend a lot of time practicing to do that, and they play at that. They stalk and chase one another in their play. Animals like zebra colts or the young of all kinds of animals that are preyed upon by lions and such practice in their play fleeing and dodging. All mammals play tag. Tag is a game that all mammals play. The question is, do you prefer to be the one running away, or do you prefer to be the one chasing? Predatory animals like your dog prefer to be the one chasing. That's why they chase cars, and they love to chase you. They also, to some degree, enjoy being chased, but they are given a preference. They'd rather do the chasing. They're predatory animals. On the other hand, prey animals much prefer to be the ones being chased. Our children, of course, if you think about it, in tag, what's the preferred position? Being chased. You know, you get to be the one who's chased until you get caught, and then you're in, and then you have to do the chasing until you catch somebody else. I can run through every single sport we have, and the preferred position, whether it's in football with the quarterback, the preferred position, the position we like to watch, the position we'd most like to be is the one who's being chased by the others. It's never the one who's doing the chasing or the tackling or so on and so forth. So we evolved primarily as prey animals, although we did do hunting, but we don't chase down game the way most predatory animals do. So anyway, that was Bruce's theory. And then in a couple of years later, he wrote another book called The Play of Man, in which he pointed out, lo and behold, human beings have the most to learn. We're the mammal that has the very most to learn, and it's not surprising that we play more than any other mammal. We play for more years, we have a longer period of childhood, and when children are free, they play. And they play all the way. They play not just as little children, they play as teenagers, they play all the way up until what we would call in our society adulthood, and also what hunter-gatherer people would call adulthood. So Bruce pointed out, not only do human children play more than do other children, but also than do the young of other animals, but also there's another difference between what human children have to learn and what other animals have to learn. Other animals have to learn what we would call the species-specific skills of their species. No matter where they're growing up, they pretty much have to learn the same things, because animals pretty much do the same things regardless of where they're living. They don't have culture to the degree that we have, where it depends, where what you have to learn depends upon the culture in which you're developing. Human beings have to learn not only species-specific things, like two-legged walking and talking and so on and so forth, but have to learn the particular ways of doing it and the particular skills of their culture. So they have to learn the specific language of their culture. They have to learn the religious values and beliefs of their culture, if it's a culture with religious values and beliefs. They have to learn the ways of making a living that occur in your culture. So he postulated that children come into the world, human children come into the world, not just with a strong drive to play in species-specific ways, but also with a strong drive to look around, see what it is that are the important skills in the culture, and to incorporate those skills into their play and play at them. So he called this a theory of play. I would also call it a theory of education. And it's that theory of education that I've been pursuing in my own research. So one way that I have attempted to extend this theory is to look at the play of children in hunter-gatherer cultures. So of course, as an evolutionary psychologist, I'm interested in hunter-gatherers because throughout most of our human history, we were all hunter-gatherers. Agriculture was developed a mere 10 or 11,000 years ago, an almost insignificant period of time from a biological evolutionary point of view. During most of our history, we were all hunter-gatherers. Now, what's interesting is that in some isolated parts of the world, some groups of people managed to survive as hunter-gatherers, apparently living in the same way as they did prior to the development of agriculture. Relatively, or in some cases, completely unaffected by modern civilization, as we call it. And during the second half of the 20th century, there was a kind of flurry of studies of these groups. Anthropologists and cross-cultural psychologists ventured off into the depths of Africa and into the Amazon, into various places in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in New Guinea, various places that were hard to get to, where there hadn't at that time been a lot of encroachment of other people, made contact with these groups of people and spent some time living among them and studying them. In all, there's been probably 2 or 3 dozen different hunter-gatherer cultures identified and studied. None of these cultures today exist in their pristine state. Some of them still enough that they're still considered to be hunter-gatherer cultures, but none of them today are completely unaffected by modern civilization. But as late as about 1980, anthropologists could still go out and study some of these groups of people relatively unaffected. Now, I've never lived in such a culture, but I know people who have, and I did a kind of a survey of anthropologists a few years ago with a graduate student of mine, and we contacted 10 different, rather prominent anthropologists who among them had lived in 7 different hunter-gatherer cultures on 3 different continents in very different kinds of climates, from deserts to jungles, from hot climates to relatively colder climates, and so on. So these were a variety of geographical places that these hunter-gatherer groups have been studied. Now, what I learned from that survey, and what I learned from everything I could read about hunter-gatherer cultures, is that there are certain similarities among these cultures, no matter where they exist. Enough so that anthropologists find it legitimate in some ways to talk about hunter-gatherer culture in the singular. Even though each of these cultures has its own language, its own religious practices, its own dances, its own music, its own culture in that sense, there are certain similarities among them that lead us to talk about hunter-gatherer culture in the singular. These cultures are all band cultures. They're all people who live in groups of maybe 20 to 50 people per band, and each band is independent of any other band, although they are connected. They know people in other bands, and there are exchanges between bands, and people marry across bands, and people will move from one band to another. But each band is an autonomous governing group. Within the band, there is a strong egalitarian ethos. There are no bosses or followers. In fact, to call somebody a chief or a big man is a put-down. You would never try to tell somebody else what to do within a hunter-gatherer band. It would be regarded as you would be regarded as trying to dominate somebody else. Hunter-gatherer cultures are extremely averse to any sense of one person dominating another person. That's just part of their ethos. And I'm convinced that it's an essential part of their ethos because the hunting and gathering way of life requires a kind of cooperation coupled with a free spirit and creativity that would be quashed in a society in which there was a hierarchical structure of some people dominating other people. Within the culture, there's very little property because people move to follow the available games. So there's no houses, really. You build huts, and then you live there for a period of time, and then you simply abandon and move on to another. So you move around sort of from campsite to campsite within a fairly large and circumscribed territory. These cultures do not condone violence. It doesn't mean that there's never any violence within them. They're human beings. There are murders that occur. There are psychopaths among them on occasion, and so on and so forth, and they have to deal with that. But they are not cultures that condone murder, and they are not cultures for which there is any evidence of any of them ever being involved in warfare. When we get to tribal societies, which really sprang off of agricultural societies, then we begin to have big men and chiefs and war, and we begin to have societies in which actually violence is valued by the culture. But in hunter-gatherer cultures, violence is never condoned. Now, the most interesting thing to me about hunter-gatherer cultures is this sense of egalitarianism applies to children as much as it does to adults. They do not feel that children are inferior to adults. They do not feel that it is right and proper for an adult to tell a child what to do any more than it is for an adult to tell another adult what to do. Now, from our point of view, that just seems remarkable. In fact, I had difficulty believing it the first time an anthropologist told me this. It was only after I heard it from a number of different anthropologists. Some men, some women, some Republicans, some Democrats, studying different groups, that I began to think this isn't just somebody seeing it through their own kind of lens. This seems to be something that all these people are seeing in the groups that they study. So there were two real conclusions that came out of my survey and by reading about children's lives in hunter-gatherer cultures. The first is that children are treated with extraordinary indulgence. Indulgence sounds like a bad word, but that's the word that the anthropologists tend to use, and they tend to use it in a favorable sense, and maybe trusting would be a better word. They trust children's instincts. They trust children's judgments. They don't have the belief that children are stupid, that children are incompetent, that children need direction. They have the belief that children are very capable of good judgments of the kinds that they are inclined to make. That doesn't mean that they believe that children can take care of themselves when they're young. Children obviously need to be taken care of. They're not able to feed themselves and so on and so forth. Let me just read some quotations just to give you a flavor of what anthropologists say about the relationship of adults to children. These quotes all happen to have to do with young children. Hunter-gatherers do not, so here's one anthropologist talking about hunter-gatherers in general. This person happens to be somebody who studies a group in South America called the Paracana. Hunter-gatherers do not give orders to their children. For example, no adult announces bedtime. At night, children remain around adults until they feel tired and fall asleep. Adults do not interfere with their children's lives. They never beat, scold, or behave aggressively with them physically or verbally, nor do they offer praise or keep track of their development. So it's not just that they don't punish them, they also don't praise them, which I think is important, because sometimes we talk about praise is good, punishment is bad, but really, if you think about it, praise is just the flip side of punishment. If you're praising, withholding of praise is punishment. These people are not in the business of trying to influence the direction of their children's behavior through rewards or punishments. Here's another quote. The idea that this is my child or your child does not exist. Deciding what another person should do, no matter what his age, is outside the Aquana vocabulary of behaviors. This is another South American group, as it turns out. There is great interest in what everyone does, but no impulse to influence, let alone coerce anyone. The child's will is his motive force. And here's yet another one about, this one happens to be about a group of Inuit in the Hudson Bay area. Infants and young children are allowed to explore their environments to the limits of their physical capacities and with minimal interference from adults. Thus, if a child picks up a hazardous object, parents generally leave it to explore the dangers on its own. The child is presumed to know what it is doing. I could go on with a long list of such quotes. Essentially, every anthropologist who's written about children's lives in hunter-gatherer cultures has said something along these lines. I have a colleague, Gilda Morelli, at Boston College, who lived among the Efe for a number of years in the 1980s, and has done extensive studies of young children in the Efe. The Efe are a group of hunter-gatherers in Central Africa. And she's shown me films of little toddlers playing with knives, playing with fire, playing with things that we probably wouldn't let our 10-year-olds play with today, although when I was a kid, kids played with these things all the time. So, but it's shocking to parents today to look at this. And here the adults are sitting back, not paying much attention to it. I asked Gilda, do the kids ever get hurt doing this? And she said, yes, they do. They burn themselves sometimes, they cut themselves sometimes, but they don't get seriously injured doing it. At least she never observed them to get seriously injured. She said most adults have some scars on their skin from injuries of that sort that they got in childhood. If you ask the adults why they let their children play with these things, they say, how else are they going to learn how to use these tools? These are the tools of the culture. Children in hunter-gatherer cultures have to really know how to use these tools. Little bows and arrows they start playing with at a very young age in cultures that use bows and arrows. Not because somebody's telling them to play with it, not because somebody's assigning them to it, but because that's what they want to do. They look around, they see this is important to our culture, and they want to play at those things. They want to play the things that they see older children and adults doing. So then the other major point is that not only are the children allowed to do what they want to do, but the children are choosing, as Bruce would have predicted, the children are choosing to play to a considerable degree at the very kinds of skills that are important skills for them to acquire within the culture in which they are growing up. So, for example, there's one other point I wanted to make. The other point I wanted to make is, not surprisingly, if you don't tell children what to do, what are they going to do? They're going to play. When I asked these anthropologists how much time did children in the culture that you observed have to play, they said essentially all the time. From dawn to dusk, 7 days a week, although they may not count weeks by days that way, but all the time from dawn to dusk, from the age of about 4, which is the age at which hunter-gatherers believe children have common sense and reason and don't need to be watched by their parents or by other adults, on through the late teenage years. There's a kind of myth that teenage years, that adolescence is a new invention, that in the past you were kind of an adult when you were 12 or something like that. Not true at all. Hunter-gatherers don't consider teenagers to be adults. They're still children, they're still playing, they're still hanging out with the other kids, and they are still learning and practicing and educating themselves. They're not expected to do much work. So let me give you just a couple of quotes from anthropologists along that line. So in response to our survey question about how much time children had to play, one of the anthropologists said both boys and girls had almost all day, every day free to play. Another anthropologist, was Karen Endicott, who studied the Batak in Indonesia, said children were free to play nearly all the time. No one expected children to do serious work until they were in their late teens. And she went on and said even then that if they're not asked to do work, that by their late teens they kind of want to start seriously hunting and gathering and joining in what the adults are doing. One of our questions was, well, when children are playing, what are they playing at? What are the kinds of things that you observe them to do in their play? And let me just read a partial list. It will give you kind of a sense of the idea that they are playing at the skills that they need to develop. So, you know, obviously the list varied from group to group and seemed to depend on what was important what were the important skills to develop in that group. But here are some of the skills: digging up tubers, fishing, smoking porcupines out of holes, cooking, caring for infants, climbing trees, building vine ladders, building huts, using knives and other tools, making tools, carrying heavy loads, building rafts, making fires, defending against attacks from pretend predators, imitating animals, which is a means of learning to identify animals and their habits, making music, dancing, storytelling, and arguing were all mentioned by more than one of these anthropologists. Arguing, it's interesting how often arguing came up, pretend arguing. In a culture that makes its decisions by consensus, the ability to get your point across, the ability to assertively argue your point without offending other people is a very important ability. They hear this all the time. They hear it around the campfire, the adults arguing, trying to reach some kind of consensus at night, and they mimic that. They try to, they go off to some of their little play, some of these groups, the children build a play village, a play camp, far enough away that the adults can't hear them. And they make fun of the adults' arguments from the night before. So if an adult did a particularly bad job of arguing, they will exaggerate how bad it was and just roll around on the ground laughing, according to the anthropologist who described this. So they're learning from bad examples as well as from good examples as they're observing adults. Using whatever the kinds of tools for hunting that are used in that culture. So in a culture that hunts with bows and arrows, the boys would play forever with bows and arrows. Tracking is itself an extraordinarily difficult skill. There's a whole book on the idea that tracking represents the origin of science. Tracking, you're making use of these tiny little cues in the sand, a little bent piece of grass, a little dent in the sand, and maybe there's a centipede track that goes over it or under it. And whether it goes over it or under it, and if you know what time of day this centipede tends to move, that gives you a sense of what time of day this animal went by that you're trying to track. They can tell not only what species it was, but whether it's male or female, roughly how big it is, how fast it's moving, whether there's any point in trying to track this thing or not. So they're developing hypotheses, they're talking about these possibilities, they're bringing to bear all their collected wisdom and constantly testing these hypotheses in this kind of way. So the point I'm trying to make is these societies require a lot of education. There's at least as much to learn to be a successful hunter-gatherer as there is to learn to be a successful member of our society. The difference, perhaps, is that in our society there are so many different ways of making a living that we go in somewhat different routes. Within a hunter-gatherer society, most people are doing pretty much the same thing that everybody else is doing. And there's also then the advantage that you're looking around and you are seeing lots of examples of what there is to do in your society. So, I might add too that the one group, I said that the boys play endlessly at hunting and tracking. One of the groups in the sample that we studied was the Agta in the Philippines, where women also hunt. And not surprisingly, in that culture, girls also played endlessly at hunting and tracking right along with the boys. So it's not that hunting and tracking is a boy thing necessarily, but it depends upon the culture. In a culture where the women engage in hunting and tracking, the girls do too. Some cultures, women do a lot of fishing, and men do much less of it. In those cultures, girls are much more likely to play at fishing than boys are, and so on and so forth. So now I want to ask the question, would this work in our culture? Is there anything to be learned from hunter-gatherers that we can apply to our culture? And to many groups that I talk to, the first assumption of most people listening would be, no, of course not. You know, we're not hunter-gatherers. We're certainly never going to be hunter-gatherers. We can't possibly go back to that way of living. Perhaps these instinctive ways of learning work really well in hunter-gatherers. After all, it was in hunter-gatherer cultures that these instincts developed. But in our culture, we've got a whole different suite of things that people have to learn. For starters, there's reading, writing, and arithmetic, none of which hunter-gatherer kids need to learn because these cultures don't have written language and they are not numerate cultures. They don't, many of these cultures don't even have number words in their language beyond 1, 2, and many. So these are not cultures that do arithmetic or math, and these are not cultures that do reading and writing. Now we think of school, the first things you're supposed to learn are the 3 R's in school. I have colleagues, evolutionary psychologists, who regard themselves as special, focusing specifically on education, who conclude that this is why reading, writing, and arithmetic are so hard to learn. They never existed in our previous evolutionary history. We're not biologically prone to learn them the way we are biologically prone to learn a lot of other things, and therefore that's why these need to be taught in the kinds of ways that we typically teach them in school. Whether or not children want to learn them, we can't depend upon children learning in natural ways. I would be inclined to agree with that argument. It makes some intuitive sense. It certainly is the predominant view of most people in education, and even the predominant view of most people who are evolutionary psychologists who have looked at education. The reason I am convinced that that argument is wrong is because even before I began looking at hunter-gatherer cultures, I had spent a considerable amount of time studying learning as it occurs in a radically alternative school called the Sudbury Valley School, which is located about 20 miles west of here in Framingham, Massachusetts. And I started studying the children at the school when my son became a student there a long time ago, and I wasn't sure if this was a good idea. So I wanted to know what happened with the graduates of this school, how they fared, and I began to actually do some systematic research. I began just primarily to make sure that I wasn't making a mistake by allowing my son to be a student at this school, but ended up becoming very academically interested in what was happening at this school. So let me just tell you a little bit about the Sudbury Valley School and a little bit about my research there. The school was founded in 1968, so this is not a fly-by-night school. This is a school that's been around for almost half a century. It has hundreds of graduates by now. Many hundreds of graduates by now. It accepts children from age 4, and children are there on through their late teenage years if they choose to stay. Same age range as the kids in hunter-gatherer cultures who are out there playing without much adult direction or any adult direction. The school operates, I should say there are about 150 students currently and something like 8 adult staff members of the school. The school operates on a per-student budget that is less than half of the per-student cost of the local public schools. So this is not expensive education. The school has, I said it has about 150 students from age 4 to about 18 or 19. It's completely non-selective. There are no requirements for getting into it except that you have to spend a visiting week there and prove to the school that you are able to be responsible in that setting. You're not going to go wandering off into the woods or that you're not going to be a danger to yourself or other people in that setting because there are no adults watching you. Your kid's 4 years old there. And so you want to be sure if somebody's enrolling a 4-year-old that the 4-year-old does have the common sense that a hunter-gatherer parent would say you have at age 4. Not all 4-year-olds have it, but most 4-year-olds in our culture do, just as in hunter-gatherer cultures they do. So within this, the school is governed democratically. The school is really set up as a participatory democracy. All the school rules are made by the school meeting. Even decisions, financial decisions are made by the school meeting. They have elected representatives who work out the details and so on. But those representatives are elected in the school meeting. All the real decisions in the school are made at the school meeting, in which every student and every staff member has the same vote. So remember, there are 150 students, some of them as young as 4 years old, and there are 8 staff members. And the school has been running for almost 50 years this way, and it's still surviving, and it runs very, very efficiently, manages the budget far better than the public schools in Framingham do. So democracy in some cases works. The educational philosophy of the school is essentially the same as that of hunter-gatherer cultures. You don't have to tell children what to learn. All you have to do is provide the setting in which their natural abilities to learn can take over. You don't have to monitor them, you don't have to test them, you don't have to evaluate them in any way. Not only do you don't have to coerce them to learn, you don't have to encourage them to learn, you don't have to coax them to learn. You don't have to do that. This is all instinctive. Any more than you have to coerce or coax a 2-year-old to learn language, you don't have to coax a 6-year-old to read or a 13-year-old to do this or that. They will, on their own initiative, figure out what it is that they want to learn. They will learn it. They will learn it in ways that you're not even necessarily seeing that they're learning it, in ways that they aren't necessarily seeing that they're learning it. But they're picking it up, and they are ending up educated in the sense that they can go on and do well in this world, even though they've done nothing that looks like school. They have read books, but they've read books because it's fun to read books, not because they're poring over and studying for tests, not because they're doing work at reading books. This has been going on for years and years at the school. My first study of the school was a study of the graduates, in which I identified graduates who had been out of the school for at least a couple of years and had done a fair amount, if not all of their schooling from what would be K through 12 at Sudbury Valley School. And at that time, there were about 80 such people. There are many, many more now. This was done a long time ago. And I found that they didn't have any particular problem going on to college if they wanted to do that. They didn't have any particular problem getting into good careers. Those who didn't want to go to college still found careers that were very satisfying and meaningful to them. They didn't feel any need to go to college. Let me just give you a few examples of some of the graduates that were in that initial study, just to give you a sense of how what they did at the school led to a career. One of the questions that I asked these people was, I asked them questions about what they were doing now, how they were making their living, and I also asked them questions about what they played at when they were children at the school. I asked them that question first before I asked them the question about how they're making a living. So here are a few examples. One of the people in that sample was, at the time of the study, was a machinist, but he was really more than a machinist. He was an inventor. He was the kind of person you would go to if you wanted to have a machine built that would solve some problem that nobody else had built a machine to solve. And very successful, very much sought after. He, at the school, was a kid who spent endless amounts of time in what we would call constructive play. He was constantly building things. He was building whole cities modeled to scale. It was very important to him to model it to scale. He was, at a certain age, taking bicycles apart and putting them together. He would get staff members to take him to the dump, and he would pick up bicycle parts in the dump and build bicycles and sell them for a couple of bucks to other kids at the school. A little bit older, he was taking cars apart. On April Fool's Day, he always had some gizmo rigged up so that depending on where you sat, you would get squirted or buzzed in some way. He was constantly, this was his play, this was his passion. And he told me in the interview that he was now doing exactly the same thing, but now he was being paid for it. But it was still with the same playful spirit and still with the same passion that he had then. Another of the graduates was a captain of a cruise ship, a woman who, as a child, loved playing with boats. There's a little pond on the school, and she would play with boats in the pond. And then she took advantage of the school's liberal off-campus policy when she became a teenager and apprenticed herself to a ship captain on Cape Cod. And by the time she graduated, she had many of the navigational skills, if not all of them, to become a captain herself. Another woman was a fashion designer, a very successful person in the high fashion industry, a pattern maker. And she, like many little girls when she was at the school, played with dolls, and she got really fascinated by doll clothes. She began making doll clothes. She then began making clothes for her friends. She then began, and for herself. By the time she graduated, she was really an expert in fabrics, an expert in how to make patterns, an expert. And she also then apprenticed herself to somebody in the high fashion industry. And that's how she went on to her career. None of these, by the way, went to college. None of these examples that I've given so far went to college. All of them went directly from the skills that they developed in play to finding a way to making a living with those skills and with those passions. There was another, and this one also didn't go to college, there was another who was, at the time I did this study, this was some time ago, and it wasn't too long after the time when home computers first became in existence at all. I mean, he was a kid who had flunked out, failed year after year in school, and finally his parents didn't know what to do, so they sent him to Sudbury Valley. He was 13 when he came to Sudbury Valley, and he became fascinated by computers. At that time, there were no computers in the school, but he, for some reason, learned about computers. He called local computer companies at age 13 and convinced them to donate computers to the school. And then he figured out how to use them and taught everybody else how to use. He was the one who brought computers to the school. By the time he graduated, he was such an expert that he founded his own software company. He was still about 20 at the time that I did the interview. The company was doing several $1 million worth of business at that time, and he proudly told me that, not necessarily proudly, but with a real wry smile, that among his customers was the school district that had flunked him out. So these are just some of the examples. There's another just to show that you can go to college. Not all the careers are careers that don't involve college. There's one of the graduates at the time of our study, he was in college studying mathematics at MIT. He is now a professor of mathematics. He was a kid, and I've seen this over and over again, believe it or not. There are some kids who just love numbers, and they just get fascinated by patterns of them, and then they develop a real interest in these patterns, and then they develop an interest in the kinds of abstractions. He also was a big reader of science fiction, and he told me that a good science fiction is a story in which you basically go with the assumptions of the real world, except you make one exception, one axiom, and then you play it out logically and see what would happen. And he said, I discovered that's what mathematics is. You make one assumption, one axiom, and then you follow it out logically. So he was a person who really grew up playing with mathematical ideas and went on to be a mathematician. I could give many other such examples. Now, not all the cases are people who went on so directly from their childhood play to their career. But in most of the cases, there was at least some clear connection between the kinds of things that they developed a love for and developed skill at when they were children at the school and the way they made a living when they went on. Now I'm running a little slower than I want to do, so I'm going to kind of speed up a little bit and summarize through the rest of this, because I want to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. We're now at point D on the handout, the optimal context for self-education, how Sudbury Valley schools like a hunter-gatherer band. The point I want to make here is that I think that Sudbury Valley School, and it's not just Sudbury Valley School, but many other settings for self-directed learning, which these characteristics would also be true at, more or less. That this school, like a hunter-gatherer band, provides the optimal conditions for children to use their self-educative instincts. As I run through these conditions, I want you to note that these conditions are precisely the things that we strip away from children when we put them in school. In other words, when we put them in school, we deprive children of all the conditions that they need to educate themselves. And then we try to educate them. And I think we deliberately take them away because we don't want them to educate themselves. We want to educate them in the way we want to educate them. I think it's important to recognize that schools developed at a time when there was no belief that free will was of any value. Free will was sin. Remember, schools developed out of the Protestant tradition. Luther was among the original developers of schools and so on. The whole point was obedience and indoctrination. If you want obedience and indoctrination, you have to take away the conditions that allow children to educate themselves, because they may develop some ideas that don't fit the doctrine. They aren't going to be obedient if they're allowed to do what they want to do. And in a world that says we need obedient people and we need indoctrinated people, that's the world in which you educate rather than allow children to educate themselves. So here are the conditions. One is the social expectation and reality that education is children's responsibility, not adults' responsibility. Clearly, that does not exist in a typical school. You have to have this structure. You can't just say it's your responsibility. You have to have it built in. It clearly is. A kid growing up in a hunter-gatherer culture knows nobody's taking responsibility for it. I have to do it. A kid at Sudbury Valley, the same thing. Nobody's coaxing me. Nobody's telling me it's important to read. I better figure out whether it's important to read, and I better find a way to learn to read, maybe even ask for help if I think I need it. Because clearly in our culture, reading is of some value. Second, unlimited freedom to play, explore, and pursue own interests. Not an hour a day, not 2 hours a day, not recess, not lunch hour, all day to do that. Children need all day to do it. They need time to get bored, too. They need time to mull things over. They need time to daydream. They don't need to be looking like they're doing something all the time. 3, opportunity to play with the tools of the culture. The real tools of the culture. So hunter-gatherer kids play with fire, and they play with bows and arrows, and they play with knives. Those are the real tools of the culture, and they learn how to use them. And these tools have to become second nature to them. They have to become extensions of their own body, really. And so it's really valuable that they start playing, even as little kids, with these tools. We get all upset today when we see little kids playing with computers, but I think little kids playing with computers are doing exactly in our culture what little kids in a hunter-gatherer culture are doing when they're playing with knives and fire. They are playing with what they see is the tool of the culture. In our culture, if you're going to be successful, you better know how to learn to use that computer, and every kid can see that. And they are driven to do it, and they learn computers faster and better than we adults do, and then they teach us how to do it. No surprise from the viewpoint that I presented at the beginning of this. The children are designed to look around, figure out what's important to learn. They don't necessarily articulate it this way. It comes almost instinctive. This is a skill that is really dominating in this culture. and I'm going to become a master at this. The access to a variety of caring adults. Number 4, it's access to a variety of caring adults, and this is the key, who are helpers, not judges. Helpers, not judges. The adults in a hunter-gatherer culture, not all of them are biologically related to the child, but they all are essentially like uncles and aunts to the kids. They love the kids, but they don't boss the kids around. They help the kids. They answer any questions. Regards sharing is really important in hunter-gatherer culture, and so sharing your knowledge if somebody asks you, sharing your expertise if somebody asks you, is an intrinsic part of the culture. Same thing happens at Sudbury Valley. The adults never push themselves on the kids, but they're very responsive to the kids, and they clearly love the kids and care about the kids. And the point about being not judges, I can't emphasize how important that is. To learn something from somebody, you can't feel that that person is also your judge. Because if that person is your judge, I mean, there are some cases you can. You're farther along, you're studying music with a master musician and who's helping you and is also evaluating you. But we're talking now about little kids learning more general kinds of things who haven't made that decision to study with a particular master and be evaluated by that master. If you want to learn something, you are far better off. You're far more likely to go to an adult and ask for help if that adult is not also the person who determines whether you make it into the next grade or not, or also the person who gives you a score on a report card. Let me just give you an example of that. There were, in my study of the graduates of the school, there were 2 people who told me that independently they told me this. These are similar stories, but 2 different people who came to the school at 2 different times. They independently told me that they had come to the school at age 15 in both cases. They had been in public school through age 15. Came to school at age 15, unable to read. Both of them had been diagnosed as dyslexic, passed along from grade to grade. Both of them told me that within a few months of being at the school, they learned how to read. Both of them went on to college, and neither one had any difficulty reading in college. Pressure prevents you from learning. And for some people, it can completely prevent them from learning. So they welcomed, when it finally came, a diagnosis of dyslexia. I'm sure their parents did too. This gave them an excuse. They no longer had to be so ashamed, but at some level, both of them knew this was wrong. Both of them knew that this was giving them a handicap. Suddenly now at Sudbury Valley, they were in an environment where nobody cared if they could read. Nobody was pushing them to read. There was no curriculum that says you have to read. But they know reading is valuable. In this environment, in a relaxed and more playful frame of mind, they could learn to read. And both of them actually, most kids learn to read at the school without asking for any help. They just pick it up. But these kids actually both asked for some help, and they got some help from the adults in sounding out the sounds of letters and so on and so forth. The 5th point here, free age mixing among children and adolescents. Free age mixing has really been the focus of my subsequent research at the school after studying the graduates. I'm absolutely convinced that this school would not work if all the children were the same age, or even if all the children were within just 2 or 3 years of the same age. The reason it works is because the younger kids are learning from the older kids. The younger kids are seeing models of higher behavior in the older kids, and then they want to do that. Little kids who can't read are seeing older kids reading and talking about books and enjoying books, and they want to read. Little kids are seeing older kids climbing trees, and they want to climb trees. Little kids are being drawn into games, say a game of cards. Little kids aren't very good at playing cards by themselves because they forget what they're doing and they don't keep track of the rules and they show their hand and they don't think ahead. But this same little kid who can't play the game with other little kids can play the game with older kids because they scaffold him into it. They say, hey, stupid, hold your cards so other people can't see them. Think ahead. Don't play that card. Can't you see that somebody else has that down on the table? And play is essential for children's intellectual development, for their social and moral development, and for their emotional development. Let me jump to emotional development. Children play in ways that evoke emotions. They play at dangerous things. Little kids swing too high in swings. Older kids skateboard down banisters. We see some of them in the Olympics. Those kids turning backwards somersaults. I mean, how the parents tolerate this, I don't know. But this is what kids do. They play this way, and some of them carry it to extremes. Animals play this way too. Monkeys chase one another high enough up in trees just for fun, and if they fell, they would get hurt. Young chimpanzees play a game where they drop from a high branch and then they catch themselves on a lower branch just before they hit the ground. Goat kids chase one another along cliffs. Why do they play in these dangerous ways? You would think natural selection would have selected that out. The theory is that they play in these dangerous ways because they are learning how to deal with fear. They're learning how to deal with danger. Even though there is a slight risk that they will hurt themselves or maybe even kill themselves, the theory is that risk is outweighed by the fact that they are learning how to deal with emergencies, so when a real emergency occurs in their life, they don't panic. All of us face real emergencies, face real dangers at some point in our lives, and whether we save our life or save somebody else's life may depend upon our ability to keep cool in the face of danger. And so the theory is that's what young adults and young children are practicing. Children are also playing in ways that sometimes get them mad. They tease one another, and sometimes the teasing goes too far and somebody gets mad. We tend to call it bullying, but the kids themselves aren't calling it bullying, they're calling it teasing. The teasing goes too far, and so somebody gets mad. Or in the negotiations that always occur about play, they may not arrive at a good solution and somebody gets mad about it. Or in a play fight, even though in a play fight you're not deliberately hurting somebody, you might accidentally hurt somebody, and then the person thinks you deliberately did and gets mad at you. But for play to continue, the person who's mad has to control the anger. You can't have a tantrum. You can't hit, because that ends the play. And if you're the kind of kid who does that, nobody's going to play with you. Adults may respond to tantrums. You might get what you want by having a tantrum with an adult, but you will never get what you want by having a tantrum with another kid. So with kids learn not to have tantrums. They learn to control their anger. They learn to be assertive without becoming angry, just as they're learning how to control their fear. We believe that there are child predators lurking around every corner, when in fact, to the degree that there are child predators, they tend to be in our churches and in our schools and in our homes, not lurking around the corner. We don't create laws banning children from school or church or home because there are child predators there. We do create laws, and parents create rules banning children from public places on the pretense or on the belief that they are protecting their children from child predators, when in fact being preyed upon by a stranger is almost non-existent. It's like being hit by lightning. Child molestations occur from people who are well known to the child and to the family, generally, not from strangers. Of course, once in a while, just like once in a while lightning strikes somebody, once in a while one of these terrible things does occur from a stranger, and then we all hear about it and we get it in our head, and we forget the fact that we are doing far more harm to our child. We're putting our child at far more risk by protecting the child from that slight possibility, and thereby preventing the child from learning how to be courageous, learning how to find his or her way around, learning how to deal with dangers, and to take control of their own lives. At this point, I really do have to stop. So